In October 1987, a routine archaeological survey in the remote Cascade Mountains of Oregon uncovered what would become one of the most horrifying discoveries in American criminal history. Dr. Patricia Henley and her team from Oregon State University were conducting a standard environmental impact study for a proposed logging road when their ground-penetrating radar detected massive subsurface anomalies across 17 acres of seemingly pristine wilderness. What they found buried beneath decades of accumulated pine needles and forest debris was evidence of systematic mass murder spanning nearly a quarter century. The initial excavation revealed human remains in various stages of decomposition, some dating back to the early 1960s. Within the first week of careful archaeological work, the team had uncovered skeletal remains of 47 individuals, including children as young as 6 years old. The FBI was called in immediately, and what began as a simple survey transformed into the largest crime scene investigation in Oregon's history. Between 1963 and 1987, over 387 people had vanished without a trace from what appeared to be a peaceful religious community known as the New Covenant Settlement. The compound, hidden deep in the Cascade Wilderness, had operated for 24 years as a self-sufficient commune led by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Pemberton. To the outside world, the settlement was a model of Christian living, complete with organic farming, homeschooling, and a reputation for taking in society's outcasts and giving them purpose. Federal authorities had tried to bury the initial reports for months, claiming the investigation was ongoing and that releasing details would compromise their work. Internal FBI memos later revealed that several high-ranking officials had received substantial payments from settlement leadership to maintain their silence. The depth of corruption extended to the local sheriff's department, the county coroner's office, and even the state's attorney general. For decades, missing person reports had been filed away without investigation, death certificates had been falsified, and entire families had simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. The first public acknowledgement of the New Covenant Settlement's true nature came only after Dr. Henley's team discovered a concrete bunker containing hundreds of personal belongings, identification documents, and what appeared to be detailed records of each victim's final moments. The meticulous documentation revealed a systematic operation that had refined its methods over 2 decades, evolving from crude poisonings to sophisticated medical procedures that left no trace of foul play. Before we descend deeper into this tale of systematic horror, this story isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of American religious history should continue. The New Covenant Settlement represents one of the most successful cover-ups in modern criminal history, and uncovering the truth required years of dangerous investigative work. If you're ready to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these stories remain buried, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from and what time it is where you are. We have listeners from around the world, and knowing you're out there gives us the strength to continue bringing these difficult stories to light. The settlement's remote location, 60 miles from the nearest town, had been chosen deliberately. Ezekiel Pemberton, a former Baptist minister who had been defrocked for financial irregularities, purchased the land in 1962 using funds from his first converts. The deed listed the property as a religious retreat center, but county records show that Pemberton had been planning something far more sinister from the beginning. Building permits filed in 1962 included plans for a crematorium, a medical facility, and underground storage areas that were never mentioned in the settlement's promotional materials. The first families to join the New Covenant Settlement in 1963 were the Andersons, the Brewsters, and the Caldwells. Each family consisted of parents and multiple children, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers. According to survivor testimony that would emerge years later, these founding families were told they were part of a grand experiment in Christian communal living. They sold their homes, liquidated their assets, and turned over their life savings to the settlement's treasury. Within 6 months of their arrival, all 3 families had vanished completely. The pattern established with these first disappearances would be repeated hundreds of times over the next 24 years. New members would arrive, typically in small family groups, and would be welcomed with elaborate ceremonies and celebrations. They would be assigned housing, given work assignments, and gradually integrated into the settlement's daily routines. The integration period typically lasted between 3 and 6 months, during which time the newcomers would be evaluated by the settlement's leadership. Those deemed suitable for long-term membership would be permitted to stay. Those who asked too many questions, expressed doubts about the settlement's practices, or attempted to leave were systematically eliminated. The settlement's public face was carefully maintained through the years. Ezekiel Pemberton published a monthly newsletter called The Covenant Voice, which was distributed to churches and Christian organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest. The newsletter featured heartwarming stories of redemption, photographs of smiling families, and testimonials from grateful members who had found peace and purpose in the settlement. Local newspapers occasionally ran feature stories about the settlement's agricultural success and its charitable work with troubled youth. What the outside world never saw was the true nature of life within the New Covenant settlement. The community operated under a strict hierarchy, with Ezekiel Pemberton as the undisputed leader and his family members serving as his primary lieutenants. Members were required to surrender all personal property upon joining, were forbidden from contacting family or friends outside the settlement, and were subjected to increasingly harsh punishments for minor infractions. Children were separated from their parents at age 7 and placed in communal dormitories where they received intensive indoctrination in the settlement's twisted theology. The settlement's isolation made it the perfect location for systematic murder. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and the rough mountain roads made casual visits impossible. The settlement maintained its own communication systems, generated its own power, and was completely self-sufficient in terms of food production. Members who died under suspicious circumstances could be buried immediately on the property, with no outside authorities ever being notified. Death certificates were forged using stolen medical credentials, and the settlement's leadership had developed relationships with corrupt officials who would validate false documents for substantial payments. By the time federal investigators began to understand the scope of the New Covenant settlement's crimes, the trail of evidence stretched across multiple states and involved hundreds of victims. The investigation would ultimately reveal that the settlement had operated as a sophisticated criminal enterprise, using religious ideology as a cover for activities that included murder, fraud, theft, and human trafficking. The Pemberton family had accumulated millions of dollars through their systematic exploitation of vulnerable people, and had used their wealth to corrupt officials and maintain their deadly operations for nearly a quarter-century. Ezekiel Pemberton was born in 1924 in the small farming community of Bend, Oregon, the son of a traveling evangelist who abandoned the family when Ezekiel was 12 years old. His mother, Ruth Pemberton, struggled to raise 5 children alone during the Great Depression, often relying on church charity to keep food on the table. This early experience of poverty and abandonment would shape Ezekiel's worldview in profound and disturbing ways, instilling in him both a deep resentment toward traditional authority and an obsessive need to control those around him. By age 16, Ezekiel had demonstrated a remarkable gift for public speaking and biblical interpretation. He could quote lengthy passages from memory and had an uncanny ability to make complex theological concepts accessible to ordinary people. Local pastors began inviting him to speak at youth gatherings and revival meetings, where his passionate delivery and magnetic personality drew large crowds. However, even in these early years, there were troubling signs of the darkness that lay beneath his charismatic exterior. Sarah Williams, who attended the same high school as Ezekiel, later told investigators that he had always been fascinated by death and suffering. He would spend hours in the local cemetery, claiming to commune with the spirits of the deceased, and he kept detailed journals filled with disturbing fantasies about power and control over others. Teachers noted that while Ezekiel was academically gifted, he showed little empathy for his classmates and seemed to view them as objects to be manipulated rather than as genuine friends. After graduating from high school in 1942, Ezekiel enrolled at a small Baptist seminary in Portland, where he excelled in his theological studies but struggled with the discipline required of ministerial candidates. Seminary records show that he was repeatedly disciplined for violating curfew, engaging in inappropriate relationships with female students, and challenging the authority of his professors. Despite these problems, his obvious talent as a speaker and his deep knowledge of Scripture earned him ordination as a Baptist minister in 1946. Ezekiel's first pastoral assignment was at a small rural church in eastern Oregon, where he quickly gained a reputation as a dynamic and inspiring preacher. Church attendance doubled within his first year, and he began attracting followers from neighboring communities who were drawn to his passionate sermons about the coming end times and the need for true believers to separate themselves from a corrupt world. However, his success was marred by persistent rumors about financial irregularities and inappropriate conduct with female parishioners. In 1951, church elders discovered that Ezekiel had been systematically embezzling funds from the church treasury, using the money to support a lavish lifestyle that included expensive clothing, fine dining, and frequent trips to Portland's entertainment district. When confronted with the evidence, Ezekiel showed no remorse, instead claiming that God had revealed to him that traditional financial restrictions did not apply to those chosen for special purposes. The Baptist denomination defrocked him immediately, but the scandal was kept quiet to protect the reputation of the church. For the next 11 years, Ezekiel drifted through the Pacific Northwest, working a series of odd jobs while developing his own unique theological system that combined elements of traditional Christianity with disturbing concepts about divine authority and the necessity of purification through suffering. He attracted a small but devoted following of individuals who were drawn to his message of separation from mainstream society and his promises of spiritual enlightenment for those brave enough to abandon conventional morality. It was during this period that Ezekiel met Martha Blackwood, a widow from Salem whose husband had died in a logging accident, leaving her with 3 young children and substantial life insurance money. Martha was emotionally vulnerable and desperately seeking spiritual guidance when she encountered Ezekiel at a tent revival meeting in 1961. Within weeks, he had convinced her that God had brought them together for a special purpose, and she agreed to marry him and contribute her inheritance to fund his vision of a perfect Christian community. The new covenant settlement was established in April 1962 when Ezekiel used Martha's money to purchase 2,000 acres of remote forest land in the Cascade Mountains. The property included several old logging cabins, a defunct sawmill, and access to fresh water from mountain streams. More importantly, it was isolated enough to allow Ezekiel to implement his increasingly radical ideas without interference from outside authorities or unwanted scrutiny from neighbors. If this story is already giving you chills, you're not alone. Thousands of viewers from around the world have joined our community to explore these dark chapters of hidden history that most people would rather forget. Share this video with a friend who loves true mystery stories, hit that like button to support our efforts to bring these suppressed stories to light, and don't forget to subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss our investigations into America's most disturbing secrets. Martha Blackwood Pemberton proved to be far more than just Ezekiel's financial benefactor and dutiful wife. Within months of the settlement's establishment, she had emerged as the operational mastermind behind what would become a sophisticated murder enterprise. Where Ezekiel provided the charismatic leadership and theological justification for their crimes, Martha handled the practical details that made their systematic elimination of victims possible. Her background as a bookkeeper for her late husband's logging company had given her expertise in financial record-keeping and an understanding of how to manipulate official documents. Martha established herself as the settlement's Mother Superior, a role that gave her absolute authority over the daily lives of female members and primary responsibility for the care and indoctrination of children. She implemented a rigid system of surveillance and control that made escape virtually impossible and ensured that potential troublemakers were identified long before they could pose a threat to the settlement's operations. Her cold efficiency and attention to detail complemented Ezekiel's passionate rhetoric, creating a leadership team that could both inspire fanatical devotion and eliminate those who failed to demonstrate sufficient loyalty. The Pemberton children had been raised from birth to view murder as both a religious duty and a family business. Benjamin Pemberton, born in 1963, grew up believing that killing was simply another form of service to God, no different from tending the settlement's gardens or maintaining its buildings. By age 15, he had already participated in multiple murders and had developed an expertise in disposing of bodies that rivaled that of his parents. His role as the settlement's primary recruiter took him throughout the Pacific Northwest, where he used his youthful appearance and genuine enthusiasm to attract vulnerable families to the settlement. Benjamin's methods were refined and sophisticated. He would spend weeks researching potential targets, identifying families in financial distress, individuals dealing with personal tragedies, or people who had expressed dissatisfaction with mainstream religious institutions. He would approach them gradually, often posing as a fellow seeker who had found peace and purpose at the New Covenant settlement. His testimonials were compelling because they were genuine. He truly believed in his family's mission and saw their systematic murders as acts of divine mercy that freed victims from the suffering of earthly existence. Rebecca Pemberton, born in 1965, demonstrated an early aptitude for medicine and healing that her parents quickly recognized as valuable to their operations. They arranged for her to receive formal medical training through correspondence courses and arranged apprenticeships with corrupt physicians who asked no questions about her unusual requests for information about poisons, sedatives, and methods for concealing cause of death. By age 20, Rebecca had become the settlement's resident medical expert, capable of killing victims in ways that appeared to be natural deaths or tragic accidents. Rebecca's medical facility, housed in a converted barn on the settlement's property, served multiple purposes within the family's criminal enterprise. It functioned as a legitimate clinic for treating minor injuries and illnesses among settlement members, which helped maintain the community's facade of normalcy. However, its primary purpose was as a killing facility where victims were systematically murdered using methods that left minimal forensic evidence. Rebecca had developed techniques for inducing heart attacks, strokes, and respiratory failures that were virtually undetectable without sophisticated autopsy procedures that were rarely performed on deaths that occurred in remote rural areas. The youngest Pemberton child, Joshua, born in 1967, served as the family's liaison with corrupt officials and outside criminal contacts. Despite his youth, he possessed a natural talent for bribery and intimidation that made him invaluable in maintaining the network of corruption that protected the settlement from official scrutiny. By age 18, Joshua had established relationships with county coroners, sheriff's deputies, and state officials who were willing to falsify death certificates, ignore missing person reports, and redirect investigations away from the settlement in exchange for regular payments. The development of the settlement's systematic approach to murder evolved gradually over the first 5 years of operation. Initially, the Pembertons relied on crude methods such as poisoning food or staging accidents, but these techniques occasionally left evidence that raised questions among survivors or visiting relatives. The family recognized that their long-term success required more sophisticated methods and better coordination between all family members. By 1967, the Pembertons had established what they called the Purification Protocol, a systematic process for evaluating new members and determining which individuals posed potential threats to the settlement's security. New arrivals underwent a 3-month probationary period during which they were closely observed by established members who reported any suspicious behavior or expressions of doubt. Those who passed this initial screening were gradually introduced to the settlement's true nature and given opportunities to participate in minor criminal activities as tests of loyalty. The Purification Protocol also established clear criteria for selecting victims from among the settlement's population. Priority targets included individuals with significant assets that could be transferred to the settlement's treasury, those with outside connections who might eventually draw unwanted attention to the community, and anyone who demonstrated signs of planning to leave or who asked too many questions about the fate of previous members who had disappeared. The protocol required unanimous agreement among all family members before any execution could proceed, ensuring that each murder was carefully planned and that all family members remained equally complicit in the settlement's crimes. The theological justification for these murders was provided through Ezekiel's increasingly radical sermons about divine selection and the necessity of purifying the community of unworthy elements. He taught that God had revealed to him the names of individuals who were destined for early death and that the settlement's mission was to facilitate these divine departures in ways that minimized suffering and maximized spiritual benefit for both victims and survivors. This twisted theology provided psychological comfort to family members and loyal followers who might otherwise have experienced guilt or doubt about their participation in systematic murder. The systematic selection of victims at the New Covenant settlement followed a carefully developed set of criteria that balanced the settlement's financial needs with the necessity of maintaining operational security. The Pemberton family had learned through bitter experience that random killings or murders motivated purely by personal animosity could draw unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies or concerned relatives. Instead, they developed a patient, methodical approach that prioritized victims whose disappearances would generate minimal outside interest while maximizing the financial benefit to the settlement's treasury. Elderly members represented the most frequent targets for elimination, particularly those who had transferred substantial assets to the settlement upon joining but who had begun to express doubts about the community's practices or who had started making inquiries about retrieving their investments. The settlement's records, discovered during the 1987 investigation, showed that over 60% of victims were individuals over the age of 55 who possessed significant financial resources but lacked close family connections outside the settlement. These victims were typically eliminated within 6 months of expressing any desire to leave or any criticism of the settlement's leadership. Single individuals without children or close relatives comprised another priority category for the settlement's elimination protocols. Benjamin Pemberton had become particularly skilled at identifying and recruiting isolated people who had experienced recent tragedies such as the death of a spouse, job loss, or serious illness. These individuals were often desperate for community and spiritual guidance, making them easy targets for recruitment. Once they had transferred their assets to the settlement and had been isolated from outside contacts for several months, they could be eliminated with minimal risk of generating missing person investigations. Families with young children presented both opportunities and challenges for the settlement's criminal operations. While parents could be eliminated relatively easily, the presence of children required careful consideration of how to dispose of potential witnesses while maximizing the long-term benefit to the settlement. The Pembertons developed a protocol for separating children from their parents during the elimination process, either by sending the children on overnight trips or by conducting the murders during scheduled educational activities that kept the children occupied in remote areas of the settlement. Children under the age of 10 were typically retained and integrated into the settlement's population after their parents had been eliminated. These young victims were told that their parents had died of natural causes or had been called away by God for special missions. The psychological trauma of losing their parents, combined with intensive indoctrination from settlement leaders, usually resulted in complete loyalty to the Pemberton family. Many of these orphan children eventually became enthusiastic participants in the settlement's criminal activities, viewing the elimination of new victims as acts of religious devotion. The settlement's methodology for disposing of victims evolved significantly over the years as the Pembertons gained experience and refined their techniques. Early murders in the 1960s relied heavily on poisoning using easily obtained substances such as rat poison or household chemicals. However, these methods occasionally left traces that could be detected during autopsies, and several close calls with suspicious county coroners forced the family to develop more sophisticated approaches that would leave minimal forensic evidence. Rebecca Pemberton's medical training proved invaluable in developing killing methods that appeared to be natural deaths. She became expert in inducing heart attacks using potassium chloride injections that were virtually undetectable without specific testing that was rarely performed in rural Oregon during the 1970s. She also perfected techniques for causing strokes through precise manipulation of blood pressure medications and developed methods for inducing respiratory failures that appeared to be complications from pre-existing conditions such as asthma or emphysema. The settlement's remote location provided numerous opportunities for staging accidental deaths that would not generate intensive investigations. Victims could be pushed from cliffs during hiking expeditions, drowned in the mountain streams that ran through the property, or killed in staged equipment accidents at the settlement's various work sites. The family maintained detailed records of each victim's known medical conditions, physical limitations, and personal habits, allowing them to select elimination methods that would appear consistent with accidental death scenarios. Documentation and record falsification became increasingly sophisticated as the settlement's operations expanded. Martha Pemberton had established relationships with corrupt officials in multiple counties who were willing to issue false death certificates in exchange for regular payments. The settlement maintained its own cemetery on the property, complete with professionally carved headstones and detailed burial records that could withstand casual inspection by visiting relatives or government officials. The economic aspects of the settlement's murder operation required careful management to avoid generating suspicion from financial institutions or government agencies. Large asset transfers were broken down into smaller transactions spread over several months, and the settlement maintained multiple bank accounts in different names to obscure the total volume of incoming funds. Property transfers were handled through a network of corrupt lawyers and real estate agents who asked no questions about the circumstances surrounding the transactions. Insurance fraud represented a significant component of the settlement's criminal enterprise, particularly in cases involving younger victims who possessed substantial life insurance policies. The Pembertons had developed relationships with corrupt insurance agents who were willing to expedite claim processing and minimize investigations into suspicious deaths. The settlement's medical facility provided legitimate documentation of pre-existing conditions that could justify sudden deaths, and Rebecca's medical credentials gave her authority to sign death certificates that would satisfy insurance company requirements. By 1972, the New Covenant settlement had evolved into a sophisticated criminal organization that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually through systematic murder, fraud, and theft. The Pemberton family had created a sustainable business model that could continue operating indefinitely as long as they maintained their network of corrupt officials and continued to recruit new victims to replace those they eliminated. The settlement's reputation as a peaceful religious community provided perfect cover for activities that had already claimed over 100 lives in less than 10 years of operation. The 1970s marked the New Covenant settlement's most productive and deadly period, as the Pemberton family's criminal enterprise expanded beyond their Oregon compound to establish satellite operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. The success of their systematic murder operation had generated enormous wealth, which they reinvested in acquiring additional properties and corrupting officials across multiple jurisdictions. By 1975, the settlement network included facilities in Northern California, Western Washington, and rural Idaho, each operating under the cover of legitimate religious communities while serving as killing grounds for hundreds of unsuspecting victims. The California operation, established near Redding in 1973, was presented to local authorities as a rehabilitation center for troubled youth and recovering addicts. Benjamin Pemberton oversaw this facility personally, using his recruiting expertise to attract vulnerable young people who had been abandoned by their families or who had exhausted traditional treatment options. The isolated compound housed up to 40 individuals at any given time, with new arrivals constantly replacing those who had been eliminated after their usefulness to the organization had expired. The Redding facility specialized in targeting victims with trust funds, inheritance money, or disability payments that could be systematically drained before elimination. Benjamin had developed sophisticated methods for gaining legal guardianship over mentally ill or cognitively impaired individuals, allowing the settlement to access their financial resources legally while maintaining complete control over their daily lives. Once their money had been transferred to settlement accounts, these vulnerable victims would suffer tragic accidents or sudden medical emergencies that ended their lives but generated minimal outside scrutiny. The Washington satellite, located in the remote Cascade foothills near Mount Baker, operated as a timber company and logging camp that provided legitimate employment for local residents while serving as a cover for the settlement's expanding murder operations. Joshua Pemberton managed this facility, using his talents for corruption to establish relationships with union officials, government inspectors, and local law enforcement personnel who were willing to overlook suspicious deaths in exchange for regular bribes and political contributions. The logging operation provided perfect cover for eliminating victims through staged industrial accidents that were common in the dangerous timber industry. Workers who asked too many questions about missing colleagues or who discovered evidence of the settlement's criminal activities could be crushed by falling trees, killed in equipment malfunctions, or lost in the treacherous mountain terrain during routine logging operations. The high turnover rate typical of logging camps meant that disappearances rarely generated intensive investigations, and corrupt union officials helped suppress worker complaints about unsafe conditions or missing colleagues. Idaho represented the settlement's most ambitious expansion, with multiple small facilities scattered across the state's remote rural areas. These operations targeted the region's large population of survivalists, religious fundamentalists, and anti-government activists who were naturally suspicious of outside authority and unlikely to report disappearances to law enforcement agencies. The settlement's representatives presented themselves as fellow believers in self-sufficiency and resistance to federal tyranny, making it easy to recruit victims from communities that prized independence and isolation. The Idaho operation specialized in eliminating victims who possessed valuable land, mineral rights, or weapons collections that could be transferred to the settlement's growing empire. Many targets were elderly survivalists who had accumulated substantial resources in preparation for economic collapse or government persecution but who lacked close family connections that might investigate their disappearances. These victims often died of apparent natural causes during harsh mountain winters, with their deaths attributed to the extreme conditions common in Idaho's backcountry regions. Coordination between the various settlement facilities required sophisticated communication systems and careful management of personnel transfers that would not attract attention from law enforcement agencies monitoring interstate criminal activities. The Pembertons established a network of trusted couriers who transported victims, evidence, and financial resources between facilities using routes that avoided major highways and government checkpoints. They also developed coded communication protocols that allowed facility managers to share information about potential threats, law enforcement activities, and promising recruitment opportunities. The settlement's peak operations during this period generated an estimated $2 million annually through various criminal activities, making it one of the most financially successful murder enterprises in American history. The wealth generated by systematic killing allowed the Pembertons to purchase additional properties, acquire sophisticated equipment for body disposal, and expand their network of corrupted officials to include federal agents, judges, and politicians who provided protection from investigation and prosecution. If you're still with us through this horrifying journey into one of America's most successful murder enterprises, you're part of a special community of truth seekers who refuse to let these stories remain buried. The depth of corruption and systematic evil we're uncovering here represent some of the darkest chapters in our nation's hidden history. Share this investigation with others who can handle these difficult truths. Hit that like button to support our efforts to expose suppressed stories like this, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on because there are so many more shocking revelations to come as we dive deeper into the New Covenant settlement's reign of terror. The expansion of operations also required recruitment of additional personnel who could be trusted to participate in systematic murder without becoming security risks themselves. The Pembertons developed careful screening processes for identifying individuals with the psychological profile necessary for long-term participation in their criminal enterprise. Ideal candidates were typically people who had already committed violent crimes, who possessed useful skills such as medical training or law enforcement experience, and who had personal motivations that aligned with the settlement's twisted ideology. Training new personnel involved a gradual introduction to the settlement's criminal activities, beginning with minor fraud and theft before progressing to participation in murders under the close supervision of experienced family members. This systematic indoctrination process ensured that new recruits became psychologically invested in the organization's success while accumulating enough criminal liability to prevent them from cooperating with law enforcement if they were ever captured or developed doubts about their participation. The New Covenant settlement survival for over a decade of systematic murder required increasingly sophisticated security measures and ruthless elimination of potential threats to their operations. By the mid-1970s, the Pemberton family had developed comprehensive protocols for identifying and neutralizing individuals who posed risks to their criminal enterprise, whether they were settlement members who had developed doubts, outside investigators who had begun asking uncomfortable questions, or survivors who had escaped and might provide testimony to law enforcement agencies. The settlement's early warning system relied on a network of informants within local law enforcement agencies, government offices, and religious organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Corrupt officials who had been purchased through bribes or blackmail provided advance notice of investigations, missing person inquiries, or suspicious activities that might threaten the settlement's operations. This intelligence network allowed the Pembertons to take preemptive action against potential threats, often eliminating problems before they could develop into serious dangers. Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Thompson of Deschutes County represented one of the settlement's most valuable assets within law enforcement. Thompson had been recruited in 1971 after gambling debts and a messy divorce had left him financially desperate and professionally vulnerable. The settlement provided him with regular payments that allowed him to maintain his lifestyle while also offering protection from the criminal elements he owed money to throughout Central Oregon. In exchange, Thompson provided detailed information about missing person reports, ongoing investigations, and planned law enforcement activities that might affect settlement operations. Thompson's reports allowed the settlement to stay ahead of several potentially dangerous investigations during the 1970s. When family members of missing settlement residents filed reports with local authorities, Thompson would ensure that the investigations were assigned to incompetent officers, that evidence was lost or misfiled, and that witness interviews were conducted in ways that would not yield useful information. His position also allowed him to intercept communications between different law enforcement agencies, preventing the kind of information sharing that might have revealed patterns connecting disappearances across multiple jurisdictions. The settlement's most serious threat during this period came from Dr. James Morrison, a psychiatrist from Portland who had been hired in 1974 to evaluate several former settlement members who had been found wandering in various states of psychological trauma. Morrison's professional evaluation of these individuals had revealed consistent patterns of abuse, indoctrination, and systematic terror that suggested organized criminal activity rather than isolated incidents of religious extremism. His preliminary report to state mental health authorities recommended a comprehensive investigation of the New Covenant settlement and its affiliated facilities. Morrison's investigation posed an existential threat to the settlement because his medical credentials and professional reputation gave him credibility that previous critics had lacked. Unlike conspiracy theorists or disgruntled former members, Morrison was a respected professional whose concerns would be taken seriously by state and federal authorities. The Pemberton family recognized that allowing his investigation to proceed could result in the exposure of their entire criminal enterprise and the arrest of all family members. The elimination of Dr. Morrison required careful planning because his death would inevitably generate intensive investigation given his prominent position in Portland's medical community. Benjamin Pemberton spent months researching Morrison's personal habits, medical history, and professional activities to identify opportunities for staging a death that would appear natural or accidental. The family ultimately decided that Morrison's known heart condition provided the best opportunity for elimination through medical means that would not arouse suspicion. Rebecca Pemberton traveled to Portland in February 1975, posing as a pharmaceutical sales representative seeking to discuss new cardiac medications with Morrison during a medical conference. She managed to inject him with a carefully prepared dose of potassium chloride during a brief conversation at the conference hotel, causing a massive heart attack that killed him within minutes. The death was ruled natural by the county coroner, who had been investigating the settlement's activities ceased immediately, and Morrison's preliminary findings were buried in state bureaucracy. The Morrison elimination demonstrated the settlement's ability to reach beyond their immediate geographic area to neutralize threats, but it also revealed the growing risks associated with their expanding operations. Each murder increased the statistical likelihood of detection, and the family began implementing additional security measures designed to minimize their exposure to investigation while maintaining their profitable criminal activities. The settlement established elaborate counter-surveillance protocols that included regular sweeps for electronic listening devices, careful monitoring of all telephone communications, and systematic background checks on all new arrivals to identify potential infiltrators. Family members were trained to recognize surveillance techniques and to identify the warning signs that might indicate law enforcement interest in their activities. They also developed emergency protocols for destroying evidence and evacuating key personnel if immediate law enforcement action appeared imminent. Witness elimination became a higher priority as the settlement's operations expanded and the number of potential informants increased. The family maintained detailed files on all former members who had left the settlement alive, tracking their locations, activities, and contact with law enforcement agencies. When former members were identified as potential threats, they would be systematically stalked and eliminated using methods designed to appear unrelated to their previous association with the settlement. The elimination of witnesses often required the murder of entire families to prevent surviving relatives from pursuing investigations or connecting deaths to the settlement. In 1976, the family of four that had escaped from the California facility was tracked down to their new home in Nevada and eliminated in what appeared to be a home invasion robbery. The murders were brutal and thorough, with no survivors left to provide testimony about their experiences at the settlement or their reasons for fleeing. By 1977, the settlement security measures had evolved into a comprehensive system of surveillance, intimidation, and elimination that could neutralize virtually any threat to their operations. However, the increasing frequency of murders required to maintain security was beginning to generate its own risks, as law enforcement agencies started noticing statistical anomalies in death rates among certain demographic groups throughout the Pacific Northwest. The very success of their security measures was creating new vulnerabilities that would eventually contribute to their downfall. By 1979, statistical anomalies in death records throughout the Pacific Northwest had begun attracting attention from federal agencies that specialized in identifying patterns of organized criminal activity. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's new Behavioral Science Unit, established to study serial killings and mass murder cases, had developed computer analysis programs that could identify unusual clusters of deaths that might indicate systematic criminal activity rather than random violence or natural causes. Special Agent Patricia Hayes of the FBI's Portland Field Office was assigned to investigate what agency computers had identified as statistically significant increases in sudden deaths among specific demographic groups across Oregon, Washington, California, and Idaho. Hayes had extensive experience investigating organized crime operations and religious cult activities, making her uniquely qualified to recognize the patterns that connected seemingly unrelated deaths across multiple jurisdictions and several years of criminal activity. Hayes's preliminary analysis revealed that over 200 individuals who had been associated with various religious communities throughout the region had died under suspicious circumstances between 1963 and 1979. The victims shared common characteristics including advanced age, recent relocation to remote rural areas, substantial financial assets that had been transferred to religious organizations shortly before their deaths, and minimal family connections that might have motivated intensive investigation of their disappearances. The investigation gained momentum when Hayes identified connections between several of the suspicious deaths and organizations that shared financial relationships, personnel transfers, and communication networks despite being located hundreds of miles apart. Bank records revealed complex financial transactions that moved money between accounts controlled by the New Covenant settlement and its satellite facilities, suggesting coordination between what had previously appeared to be independent religious communities. Hayes's investigation received crucial assistance from Detective Sarah Chen of the King County Sheriff's Department, who had been independently investigating the disappearance of several individuals connected to the settlement's Washington logging operation. Chen had noticed that the timber company associated with the New Covenant settlement reported unusually high accident rates and employee turnover compared to other logging operations in the region, and she had begun questioning whether some of the reported industrial accidents might actually represent deliberate murders. The collaboration between Hayes and Chen represented the first serious law enforcement threat to the settlement's operation since the elimination of Dr. Morrison 4 years earlier. Unlike previous investigations that had been conducted by local authorities who could be corrupted or intimidated, this federal investigation had resources and jurisdiction that extended across state lines and included access to financial records, communication intercepts, and forensic capabilities that could potentially expose the settlement's criminal activities. The Pemberton family's intelligence network provided advance warning of the federal investigation through their contacts in various law enforcement agencies, but the scope and sophistication of the inquiry made it impossible to neutralize through their traditional methods of bribery and intimidation. Federal agents could not be purchased as easily as local officials, and any attempt to eliminate investigators would inevitably trigger massive law enforcement response that would destroy the settlement regardless of whether the murders were successful. Joshua Pemberton recommended that the family consider abandoning their operations and fleeing to countries without extradition treaties with the United States, but Ezekiel refused to abandon the empire they had built over nearly 2 decades of systematic murder. Instead, he ordered implementation of enhanced security measures designed to prevent federal agents from gathering evidence that could support criminal prosecutions while maintaining their profitable operations through more careful victim selection and elimination methods. The settlement's response to the federal investigation included systematic destruction of financial records that could connect their facilities to criminal activities, elimination of personnel who possessed detailed knowledge of their operations but whose loyalty was questionable, and implementation of new communication protocols that would be more difficult for law enforcement agencies to intercept or decode. They also began transferring assets to offshore accounts and foreign properties that would be beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Despite these precautions, the federal investigation continued to gather evidence that threatened the settlement's survival. Hayes and Chen had identified several former settlement members who had witnessed murders or who possessed knowledge of the organization's criminal activities, and they were systematically building cases against individual family members based on financial fraud, conspiracy, and murder charges that could result in death sentences for the primary perpetrators. The investigation's progress accelerated dramatically when agents discovered the settlement cemetery during a surveillance operation in late 1979. Ground-penetrating radar revealed far more bodies than the settlement's official burial records indicated, suggesting systematic concealment of deaths that had not been reported to authorities. Soil analysis also detected chemical signatures consistent with accelerated decomposition, indicating that bodies had been treated with substances designed to destroy forensic evidence. What started as a statistical anomaly investigation is now revealing one of the most sophisticated murder enterprises in American criminal history, and we're just beginning to understand the true scope of their operations. The courage of investigators like Agent Hayes and Detective Chen to pursue this case despite enormous personal danger represents the best of American law enforcement dedication to justice. If you're as captivated by this investigation as our global community of truth seekers, share this video with others who appreciate deep dives into suppressed criminal history, hit that like button to support our efforts to preserve these important stories, and make sure you're subscribed because the upcoming chapters reveal the most shocking discoveries and the final confrontation that brought this reign of terror to an end. The settlement's leadership recognized that the federal investigation represented an existential threat that could not be eliminated through their traditional methods, but they remained confident that their network of corrupt officials and their sophisticated evidence destruction protocols would prevent successful prosecution even if arrests were made. This overconfidence would prove to be a fatal miscalculation that would ultimately lead to their downfall and the exposure of crimes that shocked the nation when they were finally revealed to the public. The investigation also benefited from technological advances in forensic science that made it possible to detect evidence of poisoning and other murder methods that had previously been undetectable. New techniques for analyzing decomposed remains and improved methods for detecting trace amounts of exotic poisons gave investigators tools that the settlement's leadership had not anticipated when they developed their killing methods during the 1960s and early 1970s. The breakthrough in the federal investigation came from an unexpected source when Rachel Morrison, the 19-year-old daughter of the murdered psychiatrist Dr. James Morrison, contacted Agent Hayes with information that would prove crucial to exposing the settlement's criminal operations. Rachel had spent for years investigating her father's death, convinced that his sudden heart attack had been deliberately induced because of his research into the New Covenant settlement and its suspicious activities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Rachel Morrison had inherited her father's methodical approach to research and his determination to uncover truth regardless of personal cost. After completing her undergraduate degree in forensic science, she had used her access to medical databases and autopsy records to identify patterns in deaths that appeared connected to her father's investigation. Her analysis had revealed dozens of suspicious deaths among individuals who had either been investigating the settlement or who had been preparing to provide testimony about their experiences as former members. The evidence Rachel Morrison provided to federal investigators included copies of her father's original research notes, which had been hidden in a safety deposit box that settlement operatives had never discovered. These notes contained detailed interviews with former settlement members who had described systematic murders, financial fraud, and corruption of government officials dating back to the early 1960s. The notes also included Dr. Morrison's assessment that the settlement represented one of the most dangerous criminal organizations operating in the United States. Agent Hayes recognized that Rachel Morrison's evidence provided the foundation for building a comprehensive case against the settlement's leadership, but she also understood that the investigation would require testimony from living witnesses who could provide first-hand accounts of criminal activities. The challenge was locating former settlement members who had survived their escape and who were willing to risk their lives by cooperating with law enforcement agencies that the settlement had demonstrated they could infiltrate and corrupt. The search for witnesses led investigators to Thomas and Margaret Anderson, former settlement members who had escaped from the Oregon compound in 1978 and had been living under assumed identities in rural Montana. The Andersons had witnessed multiple murders during their 3 years at the settlement and possessed detailed knowledge of the Pemberton family's criminal methods, but they had remained silent because of well-founded fears that testifying would result in their own deaths and the deaths of their 2 young children. Convincing the Andersons to cooperate required extensive security arrangements and guarantees of federal protection that extended to their entire extended family. Agent Hayes arranged for the witnesses to be relocated to a secure federal facility where they could provide detailed testimony without fear of settlement retaliation. The Andersons' accounts provided investigators with the first comprehensive description of how the settlement's murder operations functioned and how the Pemberton family had managed to eliminate hundreds of victims over nearly 2 decades. Thomas Anderson's testimony revealed the existence of detailed records that the settlement maintained on all victims, including financial information, medical histories, and documentation of elimination methods. He described Martha Pemberton's meticulous bookkeeping system that tracked assets seized from victims and the distribution of profits among family members and corrupt officials. Most importantly, he provided specific locations where evidence might be recovered, including burial sites that had not been discovered during previous surveillance operations. Margaret Anderson's testimony focused on the settlement's systematic abuse of children and the methods used to indoctrinate young victims into accepting and participating in criminal activities. Her accounts of ritualized violence and psychological manipulation provided investigators with evidence of crimes against children that carried severe federal penalties and that might motivate other witnesses to come forward with additional testimony about the settlement's operations. The Andersons also provided crucial information about the settlement's communication systems and security protocols that allowed federal agents to plan surveillance operations without detection. They described the locations of hidden radio equipment, the schedules of security patrols, and the emergency procedures that the settlement would implement if they suspected law enforcement infiltration. This intelligence proved invaluable in planning the complex operation that would eventually result in the settlement's destruction. As the federal investigation expanded, the Pemberton family's paranoia reached dangerous levels that threatened both their operational security and their ability to continue generating income through systematic murder. Ezekiel Pemberton began suspecting that longtime settlement members were cooperating with federal agents, leading to a series of elimination operations designed to remove potential witnesses before they could provide testimony. These desperate murders represented a departure from the settlement's careful victim selection protocols and began generating evidence that would ultimately contribute to their prosecution. The family's deteriorating security situation was further complicated by increasing pressure from corrupt officials who demanded higher payments in exchange for continued protection from investigation. Many of their purchased allies recognized that the federal investigation represented a threat to their own careers and freedom, leading them to distance themselves from the settlement or to demand financial compensation that strained the organization's resources and drew additional attention to their criminal activities. Benjamin Pemberton advocated for immediate elimination of Agent Hayes and Detective Chen, arguing that removing the primary investigators would halt the federal case and allow the settlement to continue operating under enhanced security measures. However, Joshua Pemberton recognized that murdering federal agents would trigger massive law enforcement response that would inevitably result in the discovery and prosecution of all family members regardless of their other security precautions. The internal disagreements within the Pemberton family about how to respond to the federal investigation created operational vulnerabilities that federal agents were able to exploit through enhanced surveillance and communication intercepts. The family's previous unity and careful coordination began deteriorating under pressure, leading to communication failures and strategic mistakes that provided investigators with additional evidence and opportunities to infiltrate the settlement's operations. By early 1980, the federal investigation had gathered sufficient evidence to support arrest warrants for multiple settlement leaders, but Agent Hayes and her supervisors recognized that premature arrests might allow key family members to escape and continue their operations from other locations. Instead, they decided to maintain surveillance while gathering additional evidence and preparing for a coordinated operation that would neutralize the entire criminal organization simultaneously and rescue any surviving victims who might still be held at settlement facilities. The escalating federal investigation forced the Pemberton family into increasingly desperate actions that would ultimately seal their fate and provide law enforcement with the final evidence needed to destroy their criminal empire. In March 1980, Ezekiel Pemberton made the catastrophic decision to accelerate the elimination of potential witnesses, launching a killing spree that would claim 17 lives in less than 2 weeks and generate the forensic evidence that federal agents had been seeking for months. The massacre began with the systematic poisoning of 12 elderly settlement members who had been identified as potential security risks because of their previous expressions of doubt about the community's practices. Rebecca Pemberton administered lethal doses of digitalis during the evening meal on March 15, causing what appeared to be a sudden outbreak of heart attacks among the settlement's most vulnerable residents. However, the simultaneous deaths of so many individuals created exactly the kind of statistical anomaly that had originally drawn federal attention to the settlement's operations. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the county coroner who had been conducting autopsies on settlement deaths for several years, finally recognized the pattern of suspicious fatalities that had been occurring with alarming frequency. Unlike her predecessors who had been corrupted through bribes or intimidation, Warren had recently been appointed to her position and had not yet been approached by settlement representatives seeking to influence her findings. Her decision to conduct detailed toxicological analyses on the March 15 victims revealed clear evidence of deliberate poisoning that could not be explained as natural deaths. Warren's forensic findings provided federal investigators with the first definitive proof of systematic murder at the New Covenant settlement, but her discovery also placed her in immediate danger from the Pemberton family's witness elimination protocols. Benjamin Pemberton was dispatched to eliminate Warren before she could share her findings with law enforcement agencies, but his attempt to stage her death as a home invasion robbery was thwarted by the FBI surveillance team that had been monitoring all settlement activities since receiving the Andersons' testimony. The attempted murder of Dr. Warren provided federal agents with grounds for immediate arrests of settlement leadership, but Agent Hayes recognized that premature action might allow key family members to escape while destroying evidence that could ensure their conviction. Instead, she authorized increased surveillance and communication intercepts that revealed the scope of the family's panic and their plans for eliminating additional witnesses and destroying incriminating records. The settlement's deteriorating security situation was further complicated by the defection of several key personnel who had become convinced that the organization's collapse was inevitable. Deputy Marcus Thompson, who had provided intelligence to the settlement for nearly a decade, contacted federal agents and offered to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His detailed knowledge of the settlement's corruption network and elimination methods provided investigators with crucial evidence about crimes that had previously left no witnesses alive. Thompson's testimony revealed the existence of detailed financial records that documented bribes paid to dozens of officials throughout the Pacific Northwest, providing federal prosecutors with evidence of corruption that extended far beyond the settlement's immediate operations. His cooperation also exposed the settlement's communication systems and security protocols, allowing federal agents to monitor all family activities and to prevent additional witness eliminations while gathering evidence for prosecution. The family's desperate attempts to destroy evidence led to increasingly reckless behavior that provided federal agents with additional opportunities to gather intelligence about their operations. Joshua Pemberton's efforts to eliminate financial records through arson resulted in fires that drew attention from local fire departments and provided investigators with access to partially destroyed documents that revealed the scope of the settlement's criminal activities. The incomplete destruction of records actually created more evidence than would have existed if the family had simply maintained their normal operational security. Martha Pemberton's systematic elimination of settlement personnel who possessed detailed knowledge of their crimes created additional forensic evidence as bodies accumulated faster than they could be properly disposed of using the family's established protocols. The discovery of hastily buried remains in shallow graves throughout the settlement property provided investigators with evidence of recent murders that could be precisely dated and directly connected to the federal investigation that had triggered the killing spree. The family's internal communications, intercepted through federal surveillance equipment, revealed growing panic and disagreement about how to respond to their deteriorating situation. Ezekiel Pemberton's increasingly erratic behavior and paranoid accusations against family members created additional operational vulnerabilities that federal agents exploited to gather intelligence about planned escape routes and hidden assets that the family hoped to use if they were forced to flee the country. The settlement's collapse accelerated when several satellite facilities ceased operations and began destroying evidence in preparation for abandonment. The sudden closure of the California Rehabilitation Center and the Washington logging operation created additional witnesses as employees and residents were abruptly dismissed without explanation. Many of these individuals contacted law enforcement agencies to report suspicious activities they had observed, providing federal investigators with evidence about the settlement's interstate criminal operations. The discovery of mass graves at the abandoned California facility provided federal prosecutors with evidence of murders that had occurred across state lines, allowing them to bring federal charges that carried death penalty provisions and that could not be influenced by local corruption. The forensic analysis of remains found at the Redding compound revealed evidence of systematic torture and medical experimentation that shocked even experienced federal investigators who had seen the worst of human criminality. By October 1980, federal agents had gathered sufficient evidence to support prosecution of the entire Pemberton family and dozens of their associates for crimes that included murder, conspiracy, racketeering, fraud, and corruption of government officials. The investigation had also revealed the existence of additional settlement facilities in other states and had prompted investigations by federal agencies that specialized in interstate criminal organizations and domestic terrorism. The final phase of the federal investigation focused on preventing the family's escape while gathering additional evidence that would ensure their conviction and life imprisonment or execution. Agent Hayes coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to monitor potential escape routes and to prevent the family from accessing offshore financial assets that they had accumulated through decades of systematic murder and fraud. The final months of 1980 witnessed the Pemberton family's increasingly frantic attempts to escape justice as federal investigators closed the net around their criminal empire. The evidence against them had become overwhelming, with forensic proof of systematic murder, financial records documenting decades of fraud, and witness testimony that detailed their methods and victims. However, the family's desperation made them more dangerous than ever, as they prepared to eliminate any remaining witnesses and flee to countries without extradition treaties with the United States. Ezekiel Pemberton's plan for escape involved the systematic destruction of the New Covenant settlement and the murder of all remaining residents who could provide testimony about their experiences. He had convinced himself that eliminating every potential witness would make prosecution impossible, even if family members were eventually captured. This final killing spree was scheduled for December 1980, when winter weather would make law enforcement response more difficult and would provide cover for the family's escape to Canada and eventually to South America. The family's escape preparations included the liquidation of assets that could be converted to untraceable cash, the destruction of records that could be used to track their movements, and the establishment of safe houses along escape routes that led through remote wilderness areas to the Canadian border. Joshua Pemberton had spent months developing false identities and purchasing vehicles that could not be traced to the settlement, while Benjamin Pemberton had established contact with human trafficking networks that specialized in moving fugitives across international borders. Federal surveillance of the settlement's communications revealed the scope of the family's final plans, providing Agent Hayes with the intelligence needed to prevent the massacre of remaining residents while gathering the last pieces of evidence required for prosecution. The intercepted communications also revealed the locations of hidden assets and the identities of corrupt officials who were prepared to assist the family's escape in exchange for substantial financial payments. The discovery of the family's plans to murder all remaining witnesses prompted federal authorities to accelerate their timeline for arrests and raids on settlement facilities. However, the remote location of the Oregon compound and the family's elaborate security measures made a direct assault extremely dangerous for both law enforcement personnel and the surviving residents who were being held as virtual prisoners. The operation required careful coordination between multiple federal agencies and specialized tactical units with experience in hostage rescue operations. Martha Pemberton's role in the escape plan involved the systematic poisoning of food supplies and water sources at the settlement to ensure that no witnesses survived the family's departure. Her medical expertise and access to the settlement's kitchen facilities made her the ideal candidate for this final act of mass murder, but her preparations were being monitored through electronic surveillance that allowed federal agents to identify the specific methods and timing of the planned killings. The federal response to the family's escape plans required unprecedented coordination between the FBI, DEA, ATF, and local law enforcement agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest. The operation was complicated by the need to simultaneously raid multiple facilities across several states while preventing communication between settlement locations that might alert fugitive family members to law enforcement activities. The tactical challenges were further complicated by the presence of innocent victims who needed to be rescued without alerting the family to the imminent raids. Rebecca Pemberton's medical facility contained evidence of experimental procedures conducted on unwilling victims, including detailed records of drug trials and surgical procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. The discovery of this evidence provided federal prosecutors with additional charges related to human experimentation and torture that would ensure life sentences even if murder charges could not be proven in all cases. The settlement's financial records, partially recovered despite systematic destruction attempts, revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprise and provided evidence of money laundering operations that extended to banks in multiple countries. The financial investigation had identified over $15 million in assets that had been accumulated through systematic murder and fraud, providing additional motivation for international law enforcement cooperation in preventing the family's escape. Agent Hayes recognized that the success of the final operation would depend on precise timing and coordination that prevented any family member from escaping while ensuring the rescue of surviving victims. The tactical plan required simultaneous raids on all known settlement facilities, coordinated arrests of corrupt officials who might warn the family, and immediate seizure of assets that could fund continued criminal activities or future escape attempts. The psychological profiles of family members prepared by federal behavioral analysts indicated that Ezekiel Pemberton was likely to resist arrest violently and might attempt to murder family members rather than allow them to be captured alive. This assessment required tactical teams to prioritize the immediate neutralization of the settlement's leadership while securing evidence that would be needed for prosecution of surviving family members and associates. Here we are, witnessing the final moments before one of the most shocking takedowns in American criminal history. The courage of federal agents like Patricia Hayes, who risked everything to expose this systematic evil, represents the absolute best of American law enforcement dedication to justice. The scope of evidence we've uncovered together in this investigation is staggering, from 387 confirmed victims to millions of dollars in assets built on mass murder. If you've stayed with us through this incredible journey into one of the most suppressed criminal cases in our nation's history, you're part of a special community that refuses to let these stories remain buried. Share this investigation with others who can handle these difficult truths. Hit that like button to support our commitment to exposing suppressed stories like this, and make sure you're subscribed because the final chapters of this story contain revelations that will leave you speechless about how deep this conspiracy really went. The final phase of the investigation also focused on identifying and protecting additional witnesses who might be targeted for elimination as the family attempted to cover their tracks before fleeing. The Witness Protection Program was expanded to include dozens of individuals who had provided testimony or evidence, creating a massive security operation that required resources from multiple federal agencies and international law enforcement organizations. The evidence gathered during the final months of investigation provided federal prosecutors with one of the strongest criminal cases in American legal history, with forensic proof of hundreds of murders, financial evidence of systematic fraud, and witness testimony that detailed every aspect of the family's criminal operations. The case would eventually result in death sentences for primary perpetrators and life imprisonment for dozens of associates who had participated in the systematic murder of innocent victims over nearly 2 decades. The coordinated federal raids on New Covenant settlement facilities began at dawn on December 15, 1980, involving over 200 federal agents, tactical specialists, and forensic investigators in the largest domestic law enforcement operation in Pacific Northwest history. The simultaneous strikes on locations in Oregon, California, Washington, and Idaho were designed to prevent communication between facilities and to capture the entire Pemberton family before they could implement their final witness elimination plan or escape to international safe havens. The assault on the Oregon compound required specialized mountain warfare tactics due to the remote location and elaborate defensive preparations that the family had implemented during their final months of operation. Federal agents encountered booby traps, hidden weapons caches, and improvised explosive devices that had been strategically placed to delay law enforcement response and provide opportunities for the family to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence before capture. Ezekiel Pemberton's final stand occurred in the settlement's main chapel, where he had barricaded himself with 17 surviving residents whom he intended to use as human shields during negotiations with federal authorities. His demands included safe passage to Mexico in exchange for the release of hostages, but federal negotiators recognized that his psychological profile indicated he was more likely to murder the captives than to honor any agreement that resulted in his eventual capture and prosecution. The hostage situation was resolved when Martha Pemberton, realizing that resistance was futile and hoping to protect her children from her husband's increasingly erratic behavior, provided federal agents with detailed information about the chapel's layout and Ezekiel's weapons. Her cooperation allowed tactical specialists to plan a precise assault that neutralized Ezekiel while minimizing risk to the innocent hostages who had already endured decades of abuse and terror. Benjamin Pemberton was captured at the California facility while attempting to eliminate the last witnesses to the rehabilitation center's systematic murders. His arrest came as he was preparing to inject a lethal dose of potassium chloride into a teenage resident who had discovered evidence of previous killings. The rescue of this potential victim provided prosecutors with a living witness to attempted murder that would be crucial in securing convictions against the entire family. Rebecca Pemberton's capture at her medical facility revealed the full scope of her experimental procedures on unwilling victims, including detailed surgical records that documented torture sessions disguised as medical treatments. The discovery of preserved organs and tissue samples provided forensic evidence of crimes that shocked even experienced federal investigators who had thought they understood the depths of the family's depravity. Joshua Pemberton attempted to escape through the wilderness corridor that the family had prepared for their flight to Canada, but was captured by federal agents who had been monitoring the route through aerial surveillance and ground teams positioned along known escape paths. His arrest prevented the activation of corruption networks that might have compromised the investigation and allowed other criminal associates to destroy evidence or flee prosecution. The raids also resulted in the arrest of 43 corrupt officials, professionals, and criminal associates who had enabled the settlement operations through bribery, falsified documents, and active participation in murders. The scope of corruption revealed during the investigation extended to county sheriffs, state legislators, federal employees, medical professionals, and religious leaders who had betrayed their oaths and responsibilities in exchange for financial payments from the Pemberton family. The rescue of surviving victims from settlement facilities required extensive medical and psychological treatment to address decades of abuse, malnutrition, and systematic terror that had been used to maintain control over the population. Many survivors suffered from severe trauma that made it difficult for them to provide coherent testimony, requiring specialized therapeutic intervention before they could participate in legal proceedings against their captors. The forensic investigation of settlement properties ultimately confirmed the deaths of 387 individuals whose remains were recovered from mass graves, concrete bunkers, and improvised cremation facilities throughout the criminal network. The systematic documentation of each victim's identity, cause of death, and circumstances of elimination provided prosecutors with evidence of premeditated murder that supported death penalty charges against primary perpetrators. The financial investigation revealed that the Pemberton family had accumulated over $23 million through systematic murder, fraud, and theft over their 18 years of criminal operations. The recovery of these assets provided compensation for victims' families and funding for expanded law enforcement programs designed to prevent similar criminal enterprises from developing in the future. The prosecution of the New Covenant settlement case resulted in death sentences for Ezekiel, Martha, and Benjamin Pemberton, while Rebecca and Joshua received life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The trials revealed details of systematic murder and corruption that shocked the American public and prompted congressional investigations into federal oversight of religious organizations and rural communities. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond the immediate prosecution of the Pemberton family and their associates. The investigation revealed systematic failures in law enforcement coordination, government oversight of religious organizations, and financial regulation that had allowed the criminal enterprise to operate for nearly 2 decades without detection. These discoveries prompted comprehensive reforms in federal and state agencies responsible for monitoring potential threats to public safety. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of isolated religious communities to exploitation by charismatic leaders who could manipulate spiritual beliefs to justify criminal activities. The settlement's success in recruiting and controlling victims demonstrated the need for enhanced protections for individuals who might be targeted by similar criminal organizations operating under the cover of legitimate religious activities. International law enforcement cooperation initiated during the investigation led to the discovery of similar criminal enterprises in other countries and prompted the development of multinational protocols for identifying and prosecuting organized murder operations that crossed international boundaries. The techniques developed during the New Covenant settlement investigation became standard procedures for investigating complex criminal conspiracies involving religious organizations. The settlement case became a landmark in American criminal law, establishing legal precedents for prosecuting systematic murder operations and providing law enforcement agencies with enhanced tools for investigating organized criminal activities that operated under the cover of legitimate religious or social organizations. The evidence gathered during the investigation also contributed to academic research into the psychology of systematic murder and the social conditions that enable large-scale criminal enterprises to develop and survive. The final chapter of the New Covenant settlement horror closed with the execution of Ezekiel Pemberton on March 17, 1987, exactly 7 years after the discovery of the mass graves that had exposed his family's reign of terror. His death marked the end of one of the most systematic and successful murder enterprises in American criminal history, but the legacy of his crimes continued to impact survivors, victims' families, and law enforcement agencies for decades after his execution. Martha Pemberton died in federal prison in 1995 while serving her life sentence, having spent her final years providing detailed testimony about the settlement's operations to researchers studying organized criminal behavior and systematic murder. Her cooperation with authorities after capture had been motivated primarily by her desire to protect her surviving children from the full consequences of their participation in the family's crimes, but her revelations helped law enforcement agencies prevent similar criminal enterprises from developing. Benjamin Pemberton's death sentence was carried out in 1989, but his execution was delayed for 2 years due to his cooperation with federal investigators who were tracking down additional victims and criminal associates throughout the Pacific Northwest. His detailed knowledge of the family's recruiting methods and victim selection protocols helped authorities identify dozens of missing persons cases that had previously been attributed to accidental deaths or voluntary disappearances. Rebecca Pemberton remained in federal prison until her death from cancer in 2003, having used her medical expertise to assist in the identification of victims whose remains had been too decomposed for standard forensic analysis. Her detailed records of experimental procedures and murder methods provided crucial evidence for prosecuting remaining criminal associates and helped medical examiners understand the sophisticated techniques that had made the settlement's crimes so difficult to detect. Joshua Pemberton, the youngest family member, eventually became a federal witness whose testimony helped prosecute corruption networks that had enabled the settlement's operations in multiple states. His cooperation resulted in the conviction of over 60 government officials, law enforcement personnel, and professional associates who had participated in or facilitated the systematic murder of innocent victims over nearly 2 decades. The settlement property itself was eventually converted into a memorial park dedicated to the 387 confirmed victims of the Pemberton family's crimes. The memorial includes individual markers for each identified victim, with detailed biographical information that honors their lives and acknowledges the circumstances of their deaths. The site serves as both a tribute to those who lost their lives and a reminder of the dangers posed by charismatic leaders who exploit religious authority for criminal purposes. Surviving victims of the settlement operations required extensive rehabilitation and support services that continued for decades after their rescue. Many survivors suffered from severe psychological trauma that affected their ability to form relationships, maintain employment, or trust authority figures. The federal government established specialized support programs for settlement survivors that became models for assisting victims of other organized criminal enterprises and cult activities. The case prompted comprehensive reforms in federal oversight of religious organizations, particularly those that operated in remote locations with minimal outside contact. New regulations required religious communities to maintain transparent financial records, submit to periodic inspections by government agencies, and provide access for concerned family members who wished to contact relatives living in isolated religious communities. Law enforcement agencies throughout the United States implemented new protocols for investigating suspicious death patterns and coordinating information between jurisdictions that might reveal systematic criminal activities. The techniques developed during the New Covenant settlement investigation became standard procedures for identifying and prosecuting organized murder operations that operated under legitimate organizational covers. The academic study of the settlement case contributed to significant advances in understanding the psychology of systematic murder and the social conditions that enable large-scale criminal enterprises to develop and survive. Universities established research programs dedicated to studying organized criminal behavior, and the settlement case became a standard component of criminology and law enforcement training programs. International law enforcement cooperation initiated during the settlement investigation led to the identification and prosecution of similar criminal enterprises in other countries, demonstrating that the systematic exploitation of religious authority for criminal purposes represented a global threat requiring coordinated response from multiple nations and law enforcement agencies. The financial investigation of the settlement operations resulted in the recovery of assets that provided compensation for victims' families and funding for enhanced law enforcement programs designed to prevent similar crimes. The recovered funds also supported research into identifying early warning signs of criminal exploitation within religious and social organizations. Agent Patricia Hayes received numerous commendations for her leadership of the investigation and continued her career specializing in organized criminal enterprises and domestic terrorism cases. Her techniques for investigating complex criminal conspiracies became standard training materials for federal law enforcement agencies, and she frequently testified before congressional committees about the need for enhanced oversight of isolated religious communities. Detective Sarah Chen's contributions to the investigation led to her promotion within the King County Sheriff's Department and eventual appointment as the state's first specialist in organized cult-related criminal activities. Her expertise helped law enforcement agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest identify and investigate similar criminal enterprises before they could claim additional victims. The New Covenant settlement case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of systematic murder for profit in American criminal history, with over 50,000 pages of investigative records, forensic reports, and trial transcripts preserved in federal archives for future research and law enforcement training purposes. The story of the New Covenant settlement serves as a powerful reminder that evil can hide behind facades of respectability and religious authority, and that protecting society from such threats requires vigilant law enforcement, courageous investigators, and citizens who are willing to speak out when they witness suspicious activities or systematic abuse of vulnerable individuals. What do you think about this chilling investigation into one of America's most successful murder enterprises? The courage of survivors like the Andersons, investigators like Agent Hayes and Detective Chen, and researchers like Rachel Morrison represents the best of human determination to seek justice and prevent such horrors from happening again. Share your thoughts in the comments below about the warning signs we should watch for in isolated communities. If you found this deep investigation into suppressed American criminal history as compelling as thousands of others in our global community, subscribe and hit that notification bell to never miss our explorations into the darkest chapters that shaped our nation. Remember to share this story with others who appreciate thorough investigations into hidden history, because these stories must never be forgotten or allowed to repeat themselves.